Evening, Ma'am Vicky.
Good evening, everybody. Hi, Kat Kaloy. How are you? Sorry, I was a little bit late. The connections were not sent earlier, but I can see that all our panelists and reactors are here now. So I think we'll start. Sorry for the slight delay. So today is the first day of the two-day activity of IPRI to commemorate International Human Rights Day. And the panel that we are going to have today is our cases of criminalization and the impunity against Indigenous peoples. And we will be hearing directly from people who have experienced this both personally and also even their organizations. As we all know, criminalization is not a new phenomena, but the way this has exacerbated in the recent years is a very, very serious concern for all of us. As a special rapporteur, I made a specific report on the extent of criminalization against Indigenous peoples, and this was followed also by other reports from other rapporteurs. Needless to say, what we are trying to do in IPRI is to make this issue more visible and more known, and of course to put more pressure into the society in general, but into states as well as other actors like the private sector to stop their efforts and their activities in criminalizing Indigenous peoples. And it's not just the activities, it's also the way that they are creating laws or policies that justify the acts that they are doing, which criminalize Indigenous peoples. Criminalization means that these players, the states, and even the private sector, they trump up false charges against human rights defenders, and in this specific case against Indigenous peoples. And they, on the basis of these false charges, some people are either assassinated, some are put into jail, and they stay long time in jail, or some are even disappeared. No, there are also extrajudicial killings and disappearances. So this kind of situation is a serious concern, and we all should be involved in denouncing this and exposing it, and of course getting the justice systems to address these issues. So for this event today, we would like to invite several of our colleagues who are from the different parts of the world to share their experiences, and afterwards we will get some reactions from some human rights defenders themselves and human rights activists, but also from the Office of the High Commissioner in Southeast Asia. No, our speakers for today are first Bestang Dukduken, who is a member of the Cordillera People's Alliance. She is the Secretary General, and she has been subjected as well to the kind of criminalization that we are talking about. No, she is Akan Kanai Igorot from the Cordillera region in the Philippines, and she is also the Asia Program Director of Land is Life. After Bestang, we will hear from Diel Gutierrez, who is an Indigenous Pygmy from the Democratic Republic of Congo. She is working with the program Integre pour la Développement the People Pygmy in Kivu, and she is an expert of the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. She is the national coordinator of the IPRI in DRC. And the third speaker is Dilip Chakma, who is a member of the Chakma people, and he is a lawyer, an indigenous lawyer who has worked with several human rights organizations in networks, including the Asian Center for Human Rights. She is also the founding president of the Indigenous Lawyers Association of India. So I'll introduce the speakers first, and then later on I'll introduce the reactors. So can we please have Best Tang take the floor?
Hello. Good evening from the Cordillera in the northern part of the Philippines. It's quite cold here, but I hope everyone is warm. Okay, so as you may already know, human rights is at its worst in the Philippines under the regime of President Duterte, and indigenous peoples and human rights defenders are the ones most affected by this situation. So first, on development aggression, and maybe many of you know this already, but our territories here remain targeted by hundreds of local and transnational companies working on the fields of large-scale mining, energy, monocrop plantations, and other destructive projects. For instance, here in my region, there are more than 100 applications of large-scale mining projects on top of 3 ongoing large-scale mining operations. And also there are 87 energy projects awarded by the Department of Energy, which include mega dam projects. So if all of these projects will push through, then nothing will be left to us, the indigenous inhabitants here. But it has been our culture as indigenous peoples to resist destructive projects. And we have had some victories like stopping mega dams, in fact, since the 1980s, for instance, here in the Cordillera. And we did that through collective actions. But they just never leave. So the threats of plunder and destruction in our lands and resources is still present. It's here. It's real. So until these days, many indigenous peoples continue to struggle against these projects. And here in my region, we are opposing the Alimit and Gined mega dam projects. And also in Panay, in central Philippines, the indigenous peoples there are continuously fighting against the Halaur mega dam project that is funded by the Export-Import Bank of Korea, and many other areas, many other indigenous territories in the Philippines. And over the past years, President Duterte has actually said that he does not want large-scale mining because it brings about so much destruction, especially to the environment. However, in April, early this year, he signed an executive order which lifted the moratorium on mineral agreements, so which means that at any time there can be new mining agreements that can be approved. So now we are about to face more challenges in our struggles against destructive projects, in particular against large-scale mining, and many of these projects are located in indigenous territories. So in this struggle to defend our rights as indigenous peoples, we are being criminalized. We are labeled as terrorists. The acts of defending our lands is being called a terrorist act, which is, as you know, wrong. And many of us have fallen victims of extrajudicial killings and various human rights violations. So, in fact, the Philippines has been among the top deadliest countries for environment and land defenders in Asia and even the world. For instance, last year, we are the third deadliest country in the world according to Global Witness, with 29 environment and land defenders killed. Behind the worst state of human rights that we are facing at the moment is the Duterte government's anti-insurgency policies, which do not make distinction between armed groups, armed combatants, and us, the civilians. So this is why so many human rights violations are taking place, and with impunity, because civilians, activists, especially indigenous peoples, are among the main targets of the implementation of the anti-insurgency policies. One of the many cases this year that we faced was the filing of a fabricated murder charge against the chairperson of the Cordillera People's Alliance. His name is Wendell Bulinget. He is charged with murder in a place in southern Philippines. We are located in the north. It is a place that he has never been to in all of his life. And also our organization, the Cordillera People's Alliance, has been a subject of state attacks, especially during the pandemic. So a warrant of arrest was issued against Wendell, and following that, the police issued a shoot to kill order against him if he resists arrest. And with all of this, it was clear to us that the intent was not simply to have him silenced or imprisoned, but it was worse. They wanted to have him killed under the pretext of, we call it nanlaban or resisting arrest. So yeah, Wendell is also the convener of the Katribu, National Alliance of Indigenous Peoples in the Philippines, and he is a long-known Indigenous activist and human rights defender in the Philippines, and has also been actively participating in international gatherings and processes in the global movement to advance Indigenous people's rights. So he and some others implicated in the murder case were eventually cleared from the case in June of this year after he spent some months in the detention center. We believe that one thing that led to this victory was the strong campaign for the dropping of the Trump Up case, which we launched at the local, national, and international level, and which gathered wide support from human rights advocates and various groups. And maybe some of you were part of that, and we thank you for that. So since then, he has gotten back to work, and with that, so of course, the threats against him continue. And then also, one of the worst cases of attacks against Indigenous communities was a massacre of 9 Tumandok Indigenous peoples on December 30 of last year, just before New Year. It happened during a joint operation of the military and police based from false accusations that these people have high-powered firearms in their possession and that they are members or supporters of the armed group New People's Army. And then 16 others were arrested and imprisoned based from fabricated evidences of arms and ammunitions. And then the key witness in the planting of evidences was killed in February of this year. And then right after that, in March, the lawyer who was defending the 16 who were jailed was also attacked and nearly got killed. And these are the Tumandok Indigenous people who have been opposing the Halaur Mega Dam project, which is, as I mentioned, funded by the Korean Export-Import Bank. And they have also been fiercely fighting against militarization of their communities and against human rights violations. Those killed were among the most vocal Tumandok Indigenous leaders. So these are just some of the cases of criminalization and attacks against Indigenous peoples, Indigenous organizations in the Philippines that are happening with impunity. It is clear to us that the motive and objective of the attacks is to silence us, which would make it easier for the government and private corporations, of course, to push through with their agenda, like for instance, the extractive and destructive projects in our lands and territories. But despite all of this, despite the threats to our lives and safety, the Indigenous peoples in the Philippines continue to struggle to defend our rights, to our lands and our human rights. But it's important to note that the unity of Indigenous peoples, the support that we get from friends, from advocates, and then the protests that we do are crucial in facing the challenges of criminalization and human rights violations. And it was through this that we have had some gains in our struggles. but then we continue to fight because the problems are still there. So we need your support in order for us to win these battles, these struggles. Thank you. Back to you, Miss Vicky.
Thank you very much, Bestang. Indeed, you have heard, the situation in the Philippines and the terrible cases of people, leaders of movements being criminalized, as well as ordinary people being killed, no, only on the suspicion that that they are supporting the armed movement, even if there are no evidences. Such actions are being taken. No, the unfortunate thing is nobody is ever brought to justice, and that's where impunity comes in. No, if the perpetrator is not brought to justice, then this really allows for the continuing acts of criminalization against human rights defenders, and in this particular case, against Indigenous peoples activists and rights defenders as well. So now we will move to Diel Mucheri, who is going to speak from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I think Diel is going to speak in French, so you can go to the English translation in that translation box. Diel, you have the floor.
Okay, bonjour tout le monde. Merci.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak here during this session. Today, I want to speak about criminalization of Indigenous people when we try to defend our rights, defend our communities and our compatriots. As you know, I work for an... yes,
That's better, yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, but maybe you have to speak louder because your voice is quite soft.
I'm going to turn off my video because I don't have a great connection.
It's okay. Okay.
I come from the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, in Central Africa. And we have great potential due to our natural resources. So we are a target of mining companies and people that want to develop agro-business on our territories. This often puts us in conflict against these corporations because they don't respect the laws that give us guarantees and the rights to our land. There is a law to protect and promote the rights of the Pygmy people, which was passed this year. There is also a land right policy that was passed last month. These are guarantees that show us that we can deal with this situation and with the rights violations against the Indigenous people in the DRC. As you know, our lands, or rather, the Indigenous peoples are spread across 6 provinces in the DRC, and we are now recognized in those provinces, which is a step in the right direction. It's a very important step, but it's not a guarantee for land rights and our own security. Because we realize now that there are zones where mining can take place, where forestry exploitation can take place, as well as cropping. And this goes against the FPIC process, the free, prior, and informed consent. Our land is desired, therefore, by these corporations, and we have tried to establish a mechanism to defend our lands, but it is very challenging. And I would like to insist on the fact that, in spite of these corporations, we really don't have a foundation on which to fight against these corporations. We are losing our identity in this struggle. Regarding the criminalization of Indigenous peoples, we have seen that there have been many rights abuses. The statistics are quite worrying. Indigenous peoples had to put their foot down against the occupation of armed forces on their territories and the exploitation of our lands. We also had to put our foot down against the eradication of national parks, which was done in an illegal way. And this is why FPIC was simply not respected. We have seen the deaths of roughly 50 human rights defenders and others, including children, women, and the elderly. Libraries have even been attacked, and schools. The attacks have been committed by armed forces, by government forces, and militant groups. Unfortunately, or rather fortunately, thanks to the advocacy campaigns, a part of the victims of these attacks have been registered. We have also noticed arbitrary arrests, illegal arrests, if you like, of human rights defenders. Over the last 5 years, we have seen these types of arrests in different regions. 12 people were arrested in the Virunga National Park. They were beaten up, whipped, and were victims of degrading, inhumane actions. And other people were attacked because they tried to defend those people. 4,000, just over 4,000 people were victims of forced displacements in Monkoto and other villages. Roughly 1,000 houses have been burned. And these are some of the impacts of criminalization. And we are trying to follow this situation. We have seen the case of Mbasi in Sisi and other cases in Ufuman village where people were killed because of people were arrested because they were defending the rights of the villagers. And this it was noted by our organization, which is an IPRI partner. We are trying to follow the situation in Bake, and we achieved the liberation of one of these human rights defenders. But there were continued threats, and our organization continued to advocate for the protection of these territories. Only last week, a mission in Ufuman was ended. It was recognized that the land belonged to the Ngasi people, but this person said that he was an owner of the land there, and the authorities recognized him as a landowner. And we led non-violent protests in favor of this person, and he was eventually released from prison. In the Walikali village, another local human rights militant was targeted. He collaborated with his son, and they were both imprisoned several times for occupying territories that wanted to be taken over for mining. They refused the forestry companies that wanted to set up there. The last arrest took place recently, but thanks to our campaigns, we were able to release them. Since then, our organization has developed a strategy for cohabitation between the Kwange family and other families, and we hope that by next year, the situation of criminalization of these people will be improved. So what I wanted to highlight was that in the DRC, we face many challenges of criminalization because the situation isn't controlled by human rights militants or by Indigenous people organizations. Some of our leaders want to use the laws to victimize human rights defenders. I can share this presentation with you afterwards, but legally the situation doesn't make sense because our legal system just proves that Indigenous people are in the wrong. It doesn't try to help us. There are just clauses that are against us. The second big problem is that we have noticed that since the 70s, is that Indigenous people are evicted from parks and they are not reimbursed. We are currently negotiating this aspect with the Congolese Association for Nature Conservation to establish a dialogue mechanism. And the first forum will take place next year in February, and it has been prepared since September this year. And we are trying to achieve social equality and recognition. We have also noted other cases of criminalization when Indigenous people defend their rights. They are categorized as trying to set up a military group or as being terrorists, or that they are carrying out illegal activities. So it's rather easy to justify the criminalization of Indigenous peoples. We also notice that we don't have access to justice. Over 80% of cases referred to the criminal court are regarding land rights, and they are not followed up. This is why we are trying to develop a mechanism that follows up these land right claims for Indigenous people to end this injustice and impunity. We want this mechanism to be validated by all partners. We want the consequences of the loss of land to be recognized, because it leads to a lot of instability and loss of identity. It leads to food insecurity, for example, and social insecurity. And these are general observations that we have made and that we have noticed since the start of human rights in the DRC. We have seen the negative effects on our identity and on our cultures. To conclude, therefore, I would like to thank IPRI for raising these very important questions and for helping us to strengthen our capacities and for its advocacy campaigns. Let's hope that for next year, we will be able to better safeguard the human rights of Indigenous peoples, all while ensuring that the different aspects of law are ensured, including the access to justice and land rights.
Thank you.
We would like to achieve a recognition through the law. We want legal text to be drafted to our constitution from 2014, which hasn't been changed since. That's what I wanted to share with you today.
Thank you very much, Jill.
The criminalization is a reality in the DRC, and we need to take important measures to deal with this scourge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jill. We have heard what's happening in the DRC and how the main actors involved in criminalizing and violating the rights of Indigenous peoples are both of course, the corporations. Again, the state, especially the efforts of the state to build national parks, which have also led to the displacement of indigenous peoples in the DRC. No, so and the other point that Jel has emphasized is that the law, many of the laws themselves are very discriminatory against indigenous peoples. So it's not just a matter of coming up with new laws, but also repealing the laws that are justifying these acts of criminalization against them. Thank you very much, Jiel. We'll now move to Dilip. Dilip Chakma, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Vicky, for the introduction. Of course, I want to thank IPRI for giving me the opportunity to speak at this event today to commemorate our Human Rights Day on the 10th. So I think a good way to start this would be to talk about the pattern of criminalization that we have seen in India that is being faced by indigenous communities and IPHRDs. And we know the most common and easy way for the government to brand someone or to criminalize is to brand someone as a Maoist or someone who have a connection to Maoist groups or someone who is a member of a militant group in India. So in fact, what we have seen in Nagaland last Saturday, the unfortunate incident where 14 innocent tribals have been killed in an ambush that has gone horribly wrong at the hands of the security forces. It's just an example of many other set, example that we have seen in India, and a set reminder, unfortunately, of how indigenous communities continue to fall victims to some of these special laws that the country have, and the militarization that some certain parts of the country still is under, and the impunity that certain laws in India provides to the security forces. So I will just start with some example to kind of reflect on the pattern of criminalization. In fact, between July and November, we have recorded about 70 cases of human rights violation against indigenous communities or indigenous persons. Out of this, in fact, more than 50% of these cases relates to some kind of criminalization at the hands of mostly the forest officials or the police, or to some, in some cases, even at the hand of non-state actors. So there's a visible pattern of criminalization and intimidation faced by indigenous groups, especially indigenous human rights defenders or those who stand up to defend indigenous people's rights in India. So this pattern is evidenced by cases that we have documented, that we see in reports, on a regular basis, and some of the ways in which indigenous communities face criminalization is, when they defend their land, water, resources, and in many cases also in false petty cases where indigenous communities are actually criminalized and detained, arrested, tortured. And if we talk about example, the arrest of Hitme Markham is a name that we should be knowing by now, who have been in detention, in jail in the state of Chhattisgarh since 9th of April or March. So in fact, she completes 9 months in detention tomorrow. In fact, I spoke with one of our lawyers last week. She confirmed that she continues to be in jail. Her bail has been rejected in the Sessions Court. So another example could be the Stan Swami case, where unfortunately Stan Swami passed away while in detention, even while his bail hearing is being conducted in the court. Of course, there are examples like Balsing Sustain Madhya Pradesh, who have been served externment notice sometime around the month of July. If we talk about, I would like to just take Hitme's case since this relates to criminalization, and Hitme is a good example, to kind of reflect on what's happening with IPHRDs in India. Hitme Markham is just a 20-year-old woman, belongs to the Gond community. She has been an activist who have been fighting for the rights of her communities, mostly on the rights of tribals who have been, who have been detaining and languishing jail for several years and months on false cases. So she has been in that moment for several years. What happened is on 9 March, in an event where she participated, the police comes, the security forces comes and detain her. And one of her colleagues confirmed that, in fact, there's not even an arrest warrant, when she was taken away by the security forces. And And subsequent to our arrest, the police claimed that Hitme Markham is linked to 6-7 cases from the period beginning to 2016 to 2021. And in fact, they even claim that Hitme Markham is a hardcore member of the banned Maoist organization, and in fact they claim that they've been carrying a bounty of more than $1 lakh on her head. So her colleague claimed that it's completely untrue because Hitme has been very much visible in the public domain. As part of her advocacy actions, she has been meeting public officials, including ministers, legislators, even the chief minister, and there are photographs and videos that establishes respect, that she has been very much visible, among the people. And it's not like, suddenly the police realizes that, there is someone who has been missing. No, it's not true, because everyone knew where she lives. If she had been a member of a banned organization, they could have just gone and picked her up, at any time, in the last few years. They didn't do that. So I spoke to one of her colleagues who was also present during the time when she was arrested. She claims, that Hitme Markhams and activists have been fighting for the rights of those who have been in jail, to release them. She is part of a committee that has been fighting for the rights for several years. In fact, her colleague claims that, Hitme has been a target of the groups, of the security forces, the authorities, because she kind of has become a link between those in jail and the larger human rights movement in India. So an easy way out for the government, for the authorities, was to cut off the link. So that's exactly what happened. In fact, the complaint filed with the PUCL in NSRC, they also make similar claims. They said like her arrest is just a tool to intimidate and to send a strong message to other human rights defenders, not to speak boldly against state repression. So this is Hitme's case, which is unfortunate because, in fact, one of our lawyers claimed there is no evidence against her, but unfortunately she continues to be in jail, and there's not much of reports in the news. There's not much of any updates on what's happening to her, but it has been confirmed by a lawyer, she's still in jail. Next, I would like to speak on eviction or for displacement of tribal communities. That's another bigger issue in the country right now. Of course, cases of forced eviction have been increasing. In fact, in the last 2 years, if we look into the pandemic period, there's have been an increasing number of evictions that we have seen in India. In fact, when the Prime Minister of India last year in March 2020 announced a nationwide lockdown for the COVID pandemic, he had pleaded with folded hands to the citizens, not to venture out of the house, to stay home, to stay indoors. But the irony is, during the last 2 years, indigenous communities have been evicted, from their homes, from their own lands. So that's the irony. At one point, the government is asking people not to venture out, stay home. But on the other hand, tribals are being evicted from their own homes. In fact, we can recall, the UN special report on housing has in fact, pleaded with states not to carry out eviction till the pandemic ends. In fact, even the Indian National Human Rights Commission chairperson has also stated that, evictions should not be carried out during this period. And the government claim is, there is no eviction in the country, but the reports say otherwise. We have between April 2020, that's when the pandemic began, till November 2021, we have documented as many as 17 cases of forced eviction of indigenous communities in the country. The thing is with eviction, what happened is, other than in addition to the eviction that they undergo, they are also subjected to various kinds of atrocities, torture, arrest. And if we look into the nature of the eviction, out of 17 cases, most of the time, in 15 of 17 cases, forest officials are involved directly in the eviction. And again, if we analyze the nature of violations, while this eviction has been carried out, we see like burning down of houses belonging to the tribal communities, demolishing houses, destruction of standing crops and agricultural land, and victims in many cases are also subjected to torture during this eviction drive. In fact, even non-state actors are also involved while police and forest officials carry out these eviction drives. And one example I would like to cite is the Odisha example. There's a case from Odisha, where I think in the month of June, 20th of June, where 30 to 35 families have been evicted. It involves more than 200 family members, majority of whom belongs to tribal communities and a few families from the Dalit communities who have been evicted from the Sahaspur Reserve Forest, Kalani district of Odisha. And in fact, they had to plead to a neighboring state after they have been evicted, and they were sheltered temporarily in some school, and many of them have been sheltered in plastic sheets for several months. In fact, one of the complainants, one of our friend from Odisha, a human rights activist, Dilip Kumar Das, he have reported that, in fact, forest officials have been directly involved with this, though they claim they don't have any role in this hand, because this eviction have been actually carried out by a group called, some forest protection committee or something, which is again formed by the forest department to protect reserve forests. So Dilip does claim that, the forest officials have been secretly involved in driving out these tribal communities from the district. There are several cases. In fact, there was a case several years ago where the National Human Rights Commission have said that eviction should not be carried out unless there is an arrangement for rehabilitation to these tribal communities. From that case on, direct involvement of the forest official is not seen, but they indirectly involve these forest protection committees to carry out eviction, like the case I had just cited from the state of Odisha. And finally, I would like to talk about, the impacts of the post-pandemic economic recovery plans on indigenous communities in India. Again, of course, we already know how COVID-19, and the response of the government to COVID-19 in the country have affected tribal communities immensely. However, even the post-COVID era, where the government is about to start its economic program to recovery, even these programs are going to affect tribal communities immensely in the country. We know, just last year, the Prime Minister of India have announced a special package just in response to the COVID. It amounts to 265 billion USD, which is like 10% of the country's GDP, to help the country to recover from the implication of the COVID on the economy. Unfortunately, indigenous communities or tribal do not figure in this scheme. They don't have any mention, though they were the one who have been the most vulnerable during the entire pandemic time. On the other hand, if you look into the recovery agenda of the country, the economic agenda, of course, they are going to have direct and serious implications on indigenous peoples, because we all know, how economic recovery is directly linked to indigenous communities' access to land and resources. And India's recovery plans are directly linked to extract industries, the coal mining, the bauxite mining protests we already have been seeing for the last couple of months in the state of Odisha, Jharkhand. So these are going to have a serious implication on indigenous communities, the way the government of India is set to carry out its economic agenda for recovery from the COVID implication. And like I said, these plans scheme that have been announced till date do not mention anything about the indigenous communities. On the other hand, what this scheme and plans of the government does is they try to make the environment, business friendly, for business to step in, to extract natural resources, which are mostly inhabited by tribal communities in the eastern, central, south of the country. And in fact, in the last 2 years, we have seen several proposals for amendment of certain laws from the government of India. Some of those will be draft environmental impact assessment in 2020, and also recent proposal to amend certain provision of the Forest Rights Act. So instead of protecting indigenous communities' rights, the government's scheme, the post-COVID recovery scheme, is trying to make the environmental business friendly so that they can come in and extract the resources. And most of these resources belong to tribal lands. And so what we have seen is, the laws in India that we have that recognizes or protect tribal right to some extent. they are not implemented. But forget about implementation. Instead of enhancing these rights, what the government is trying to do is trying to dilute this further. So therefore, in the coming few years, the post-COVID recovery period, I foresee many more conflicts in indigenous territories, and of course, there will be more violation of indigenous people's rights as a result of these economic programs. And of course, like always, tribal communities in the country will be the most, victimized, that will be suffering in the long run. Yeah, thank you, Vicky.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dilip. Vicky had to step out for another commitment, another speaking engagement that she has. So later on, Joyce will be taking over to moderate. So can I pass this on to Joyce?
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you clearly.
Yeah, right. Okay. So thank you very much again, Dilip. So for the interest of time, we just want to welcome also our reactors to provide their perspective in relation to the work that they do in the region, and also to the discussions and the points that was raised earlier by our Indigenous defenders from DRC, India, and the Philippines, and to react on this, on how to respond to this continuing criminalization and human rights violations against Indigenous peoples in within these two regions. So first, I'd like to ask Katya. So Katya Chiritsi. Katya is a Deputy Regional Representative of the OHHR Southeast Asia since 2015. And prior to this, she has worked with OHHR in several activities in Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and in Geneva. So over more than 2 decades, she has focused work on the protection and promotion of human rights in conflict and post-conflict settings. And the next speaker is Carlos Conde. He's the senior researcher at the Asia Division of Human Rights Watch, covering the Philippines. His current research focuses on the ongoing war on drugs in the Philippines, where thousands have died and suffered. He has done research on extrajudicial killings of activists, journalists, legal professionals, peasant leaders, environmentalists, and indigenous peoples. And last from our reactors is Milako Tegagan. Although I believe he's not yet in, his messages about his issues on internet connection, but hopefully he can join in. So Milako is a member of the working group on Indigenous peoples, populations, and communities of the African Commission on Human Rights. He has worked as a development consultant and coordinator for a number of country and regional development programs with regional NGOs. His areas of expertise include civil society, gender, ethnicity and ethical conflicts, pastoral people's issues, and communication for development. So without further ado, let me welcome Ms. Katya to provide her reaction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joyce, and a very good evening or afternoon or morning, depending on where you're joining us from. It's a real pleasure to join you all today on behalf of the OHCHR Regional Office for Southeast Asia, and to join you all for this commemoration of Human Rights Day, with a critical focus on the criminalization of violation and impunity against Indigenous people human rights defenders. It was extremely compelling to hear the accounts and the stories of the speakers who were sharing their experiences before my intervention, which really speak not just to the challenges in our region in Asia, but the common challenges which go beyond this region through the stories shared from the colleague based in the DRC. And we really, a common thread of the issues and the stories which have been shared with us is really how regionally and globally the accelerating quest for natural resources is turning land and environmental issues related to this into one of the most contentious human rights issues. Everything that has been shared with us shows how local communities who try to stand up for their rights become the targets of threats, intimidations, violent attacks, judicial harassment and killings by states, government, companies, but also security firms and criminal organizations. And we see that there is a dramatic increase in the attacks against human rights defenders, and in particular Indigenous rights defenders in the region and globally. And these are those who stand up to oppose crimes and injustices in relation to land grabbing, environmental destruction linked to large-scale agribusiness development, energy projects. And we heard, for instance, a lot through the DRC case, also in what happens around the mining, extractive industries context. And certainly, both in the region and beyond the region, governments and businesses are increasingly using inflammatory language to stigmatize human rights defenders, including Indigenous people's rights defenders, environmental human rights defenders, with worth mentioning women human rights defenders being particularly exposed to gender-based violence and harassment, including in the context of criminalization. Now, it has also been mentioned before that in many cases there is good legislation and policies, but the issue comes with the gap and the lack of their effective implementation. And legislation, for instance, related to forestry, mining, and energy sector is not always harmonized with the Indigenous people's rights, and these very rights are disregarded in the name of the prioritization of commercial interests. And just to mention the example of the Philippines, where we know that the Indigenous People's Rights Act was enacted in 1997, but as we heard through the very compelling situation and stories shared a few minutes ago, violations are continuing on a daily basis. Now, of course, governments carry the primary responsibility to ensure that Indigenous people rights are protected and that Indigenous people can safely exercise their rights, especially those who have been in the front line of protecting territories and natural resources for a long time. A big challenge that we see in the region and beyond is linked to the increased privatization and the in relation to land ownership and the lack of recognition of traditional occupation of land and territories and resources which are determining the scope for Indigenous people rights, and the lack, of course, of recognition of Indigenous people's tenure rights, in particular the collective aspects of these rights. So I think it's very important to underline that it's not always an issue related to lack of available frameworks and guidance on the action to be made, but it's about the political will to take that action. And I would like to end with a reflection which speaks to the strong linkages between a number of the issues that we have heard about tonight and the business and human rights framework and agenda. And we know that both in this region and beyond, a number of governments are at various stages of either drafting a national action plan on business and human rights or adopting it or being in the implementation phase. And while these commitments are really welcomed, a number of those action plans are pretty weak on the element which takes care of the protection of human rights defenders. And so it is critical that both in the formulation of these action plans, but equally importantly, when they are implemented, that protection element is addressed in a meaningful manner, in a highly consultative and transparent process, so that human rights defenders have a voice and a seat at the table, and is not just moved ahead in a tokenistic fashion. So I will leave it here with these preliminary thoughts, and I would be very happy to address any questions or comments that colleagues and friends following us might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Katya. And indeed, it's as discussed and shared also from the experience of our panelists earlier regarding the stigmatization of human rights defenders, which is linked to shrinking of democratic space, which is an issue within the region and beyond. And also linked to that for Indigenous peoples are on the discrimination against their culture and particularly in relation to managing their and protecting their lands, which also reflects to what was shared also in DRC. So thank you for that. Our next reactor will be Carlos Conde from Human Rights Watch.
Hi, thank you, Joyce, and thank you everybody for this event and for inviting me to be here. The one thing that struck me about the presentation by our three presenters was just how similar the experiences are in regions or in countries, and that is something that what happened in DRC, what happened in India, it's also happening in the Philippines. Bisang earlier highlighted the development aggression that's happening in indigenous peoples areas in the northern Philippines. I would, however, like to point out that this same phenomenon is happening in other parts of the country, particularly in Mindanao, where we have a large population of indigenous peoples, but also in the central Philippines as well. So anywhere where large corporations are operating, basically, you will see incidents of development aggression and the related violations that occur, such as now what we're talking about, the criminalization of indigenous people's leaders or indigenous people's activists and human rights defenders. And this is really, really, I think, disappointing, to say the least, that this is happening in many regions. But in the Philippines, where I am from Mindanao myself, I have been documenting or monitoring what's happening to our IP sector, and this is particularly hard in rural areas of the country where indigenous peoples are, and the entry of extractive industries has been a particularly brutal, I would say, phenomenon in many of these areas. In Mindanao, I remember when I was a journalist working there, I came across the word genocide to refer to not genocide, ethnocide. Sorry, to refer to the systematic violations of the rights of indigenous peoples, which often takes in the form of extrajudicial killings and horrific attacks against them. I think this is not so much an elephant in the room, but is something that not just in this forum, not necessarily in this forum, but in others, where the role of corporations are often left untouched, often left unexplored. And I think that's something that the indigenous peoples movement around the world should start giving some serious thought. I think, from my perspective, that there needs to be an improvement in terms of considering business and human rights as an advocacy point. I mean, I'm a researcher. I also, tackle business and human rights issues, and this is something that, while I haven't really done significantly enough. This is something that I think needs to be given much attention in the Philippines and many other areas. Advocate, targeting specific firms for advocacy, as well as targeting Western blocs where these companies operate. For instance, the European Union, the United States, and other areas. I think the role that companies have played in the dispossession of indigenous peoples, not just in the Philippines, have not been explored extensively, and so as a result, they have not been taken into account, in any significant way that they should be. I mean, for instance, the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism has just put out a series of reports in Palawan where IPs there are being displaced by companies who are mining the areas for nickel and other resources. So I think the discourse on the role of these often multinational companies who are sometimes or often in cahoots with local companies needs to be explored and documented. Also touched upon in the presentations was the role of government agencies like, for instance, the National Culture of Indigenous Peoples in the Philippines, and I would imagine in many other countries around the world where indigenous peoples are present. I mean, in the experience of the Philippines, these agencies are often working closely with government and working also with state security forces who are being accused of committing many of these abuses. So they too need a closer look and perhaps an auditing of exactly how they are performing their mandate. Because I was seeing in the Philippines, the NCIP particularly has not been doing that mandate to protect indigenous peoples. It more often supports the military and state forces and the government who are that is being accused of these violations. So that is important. And one final point that I would like to make is the role of insurgent groups in all of this and how this can be addressed in the Philippines and elsewhere. And I think this was also mentioned partly by Dilip. Insurgent groups play a crucial role in these areas where indigenous peoples are present. But I think they have, well, in the Philippines at least, there have been efforts to try to include them in the dialogue, often in the form of a peace process. But I think, given that the violations continue to occur, even as we've spent decades and years talking peace with insurgent groups. I mean, the government spending years and years talking with insurgent groups about these issues. Not much has changed by way of in terms of how indigenous peoples in the Philippines are being affected by the conflict. So that too, I think, needs to be addressed in a more significant way. I don't have ideas right now on what to do that, and I don't presume to know how to do that. But I think the role of insurgent groups in all of this needs to be explored, and the dynamic that they have with the government and the dynamic with tribal communities or indigenous peoples communities, and how this can be harnessed or this can be explored so that violations like these can be avoided, so that criminalization of IPs as well as those who support them can be avoided. I think I'll stop there. There's a lot of things to unpack. But again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that overview and insight also, Carlos. And I think it's true, and I believe earlier in the chat group, Vicky has also mentioned about the importance of further exploring, because I believe indigenous peoples and organizations have been working on issues involving business and human rights and violations linked to development aggressions. in the Philippines and beyond. And she emphasized like there is a further need now, especially because there's also stronger call for better environmental protection and climate change, and the role and how these corporations actually is responsible, aside from the states, of course, and for other duty bearers. So thank you for that. And I think I also want to add regarding the PCIJ report, I think they also highlighted, which is usually hard to resolve or highlight or understand, is how corporations or these development projects breaks the unity of the community, of indigenous communities, which is very crucial for indigenous peoples. And I think, and that's how we just say, not as obvious as opposed to criminalization and killing and violations, but these are negative impacts that definitely affects how indigenous communities work, and that is present in the Philippines, I'm sure in India and in the African region as well, in DRC and Kenya, at least for the work that it has experienced. So I think Belako is not yet in. So maybe while waiting for him to get connected, we would like to already welcome any questions or comments from the participants to any of our panelists, including our reactors. So you can raise your hand, or, oh, I see hands raised now. Or you may also leave questions in the chat room. So Basavi Kuru, would you like to ask your question now? Are you online? Basavi, can you, while we wait for our last reactor? You have to unmute yourself, Basavi, if you want to speak. No? So how about Jackson? Jackson, are you online now? You able to pose your question? Or Austin, you'd have to unmute. Basavi, yes, I see you. Sorry. You're still on mute though.
Hello. Hello.
Is this Jackson?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. You may identify who you want to really respond your question to, or if it's a general question. Yeah, please. You may speak now.
Pardon?
Yeah, you may ask your question now.
Okay. I didn't have a question, but let me actually comment on what we are facing, because what I've heard about India, Congo, and Philippines is just the same thing that's happening here in Kenya. We have been actually partnering with IPRI on the issue of Kidong, and the kind of human rights victimization that has been going on has been too much. A number of people have been arrested, and then there have been actually threats of being evicted. And when people stand against, then they are harmed. Last month, we had one guy who was attacked. The bush, some criminals were actually hired to harm them. Therefore, we are finding the same thing happening among all the indigenous communities worldwide, especially in Africa and Asia. And it's actually a general problem. And we have also tried to look for alternatives, seeking redress. Last year with IPRI and Rivers in Development, no, RCNet, we wrote to the president, try to see if he can actually respond, and it wasn't again. Therefore, we have, as indigenous communities, we are facing a lot of problems, but I see at the end of the day, we shall actually bear fruits because of our persistence. The issue of killing has not been so much in Kenya, but the issue of cases in court and try to silence them has been one of the major challenges. Therefore, I really back the other teams and the call for our united voices and actions to support one another in amplifying our voices to make sure that at least the rights of human rights defenders are fully protected and their lives are also safe. Thank you, and I really appreciate those who are partnering with us, especially IPRI. They have been so close, supporting, because we really faced a lot, including division among our people to try to divide them, to weaken. But through partnership and working together has been actually a source of our strength, and we really appreciate. And we look forward to work more as we progress. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that comment, Jackson. Let me go back to Basavi, if you're online now. Basavi, would you like to speak? So let's move on to Stella. Stella, are you raising that same question you posted on our Q&A box?
Yeah,
but you may,
thank you
all right.
to Joan for answering the question. I would actually like to hear a little bit more from the panelists, especially Mr. Chakma, who just now provided us a glimpse of what's to come. So if you want me to repeat the question again, my question is, that right after COP26, we are seeing a lot of buzz around just transition, and which basically means transiting from coal as the major energy source to cleaner and more renewable energy. But this would also involve, a lot of hydro energy and solar energy, wind energy, etc. And there is a fear, a lot of people are concerned that this could lead to greater land grab of indigenous territories, which is already a big issue. So I would like to know what do our panelists think of this, and what is likely to happen when this just transition starts.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Stella. Dilip, would you like to respond to that before we ask the others?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Yes, coal has been a big issue. In fact, if we look back in the last 2 years, even during the middle of the pandemic, the government has actually given auction to this coal mining for private companies. Yeah, so a lot of this coal mining areas belong to Eastern Central India, which are majorly inhabited by tribal communities. So there's a big concern. Of course, in recent months, again, there's a huge series of protests against bauxite, extracting mines in the state of Odisha. So extracting industry is a big concern. Of course, you have just mentioned about the problem with the coal in India, right? The power. With the kind of COVID, recovery economic as the government, we are going to need, huge amount of coal again, more than what we are needing before the COVID. So that's a big issue. So tribal communities concern and concern of other communities is tribal communities are going to be impacted majorly because of this agenda. And if we look into the efforts of the government, we look at two things, like the government's attempt to change certain things. Like one is the EIA, the environmental impact assessment. It's like the government trying to do away with regulatory mechanism, to make things easier for companies or for the government on behalf of companies to go and acquire lands. Like land grab, issue of land grab comes in. Again, we also see certain attempt by the government to bring changes to the Conservation Act, which is basically trying to tweak away the system. Like in Fifth Schedule area, we have the PESA Act, right? That kind of recognize the Gram Sabha's power to give consent and be consent in terms of land acquisition. But it's not happening. So the main concern would be the government challenge, attempt to try to change this laws, to dilute laws so that it makes things easier for companies to go in. So the challenge for indigenous communities is, to try to demand implementation of PESA. Like PESA is a big issue in the coal areas. Like what we have seen in the Chhattisgarh, despite the Gram Sabhas belonging to the tribal communities opposing this acquisition or this, acquisition of land for coal mining, still some of these projects are going ahead. So which shows, the PESA Act has failed in some of the states. So one of the major demand for us should be, to implement PESA. Also, I would like to add one more thing. PESA is supposed to cover 10 states, but even after 25 years of its implementation, we have just 6 states that have framed rules. 4 states have not framed rules to implement this law at all. Even the states where rules have been framed, the law is not being implemented in its true spirit. So these are major concerns and challenges, for all of us, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Dilip. We've reached our sort of ideal time. We'll be over time, but I just asked panelists, including the reactors, if there are any last thoughts. I see John raising her hand, but I'll probably also take that as an opportunity for her to provide the closing remarks. So for the panelists, any last words? Are we still here? DL and Destang? Are there any last thoughts before we move on to our reactors? I think not. So we move.
Oui.
Oh yeah.
Par rapport à la question des...
Yes, I'd like to add something regarding... I would like to... I would like to say that regarding certain indigenous leaders in a certain province, I actually only spoke about the year 2021. I didn't speak about other years and other violations. For example, a major incident in 2017. So I think it's key to look at the impacts of businesses on human rights. It's important to note I'm sorry, the sound isn't good enough.
Voilà des situations auxquelles on a été alerté par les peuples autochtones. On s'est beaucoup plus focalisé dans ces coins-là. S'il estime qu'il y a d'autres cas qui nécessitent une analyse approfondie, qui sont...
We need a developed analysis of the situation today and share our experiences That's what I would like to add. The situation of human rights abuses is seen everywhere in the 21 provinces in the DRC. There are numerous cases, but I actually only looked at the cases from 2021. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, DL.
Thank you, DL.
I see Carlos is need to jump to another meeting. Before I ask Bestan, would you like to maybe ask Carlos to provide his last thoughts?
Well, yeah, thank you so much, Joyce, and I'm really sorry that I need to jump off, but yeah, it has been a pleasure sharing ideas and hearing all these thoughts and perspectives from the panelists and the participants. So it has been a pleasure, and you can expect solidarity from Human Rights Watch about the struggle for IP rights, and more specifically about the campaign to end criminalization of IP activists and IP indigenous peoples in the Philippines and beyond. So on that note, I bid everybody good night and carry on, and thank you so much again.
Thank you very much. It was great having you, Carlos. Bestan?
Yeah, thank you, Joyce. Just very briefly on that renewable energy. Renewable energy may or may not be friendly to indigenous peoples. And with the transition to renewable energy, indigenous peoples should not be sidelined. We have to be part of any process, of any decisions related to our lands and territories. And then it's very important that free, prior, and informed consent is ensured in these renewable energy projects and processes. Now, one of our core issues is that our ownership of our lands is not recognized. So if this continues, then nothing in all of our problems will be resolved, which is why it's very important for us to stay vigilant, to be part, to learn more about this just transition, and to be part of conversations. What the previous panelists and reactors have said is also true, that wherever we are in the world, we face the same issues, the indigenous peoples, on the violations of our rights. And so it would be good for all of us, indigenous peoples, indigenous rights advocates, human rights defenders and advocates, and environmental activists to continue these kinds of conversations. Let us learn from each other, let us forge solidarity. And maybe through the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, we can have some joint or coordinated actions and campaigns, specifically on criminalization and in general, Indigenous people's rights. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for that, Bestan, and reminding us again the importance of solidarity amongst Indigenous peoples and allies. Katya?
Yes, thank you, Joyce. And also on our side, I would like to reiterate that our office is strongly committed to continue working with you all, and criminalization of the human rights defenders. It's a key concern, and we will certainly continue to prioritize this work and our partnership with the colleagues in the region and beyond. One takeaway from the discussion today is the very similarities among several regions and how we can learn from each other's experiences, and to use the business and human rights framework also as an entry point, but as an opportunity to hold rights duty bearers accountable as also an opportunity for right holders. So I'll keep it there, and I also apologize because I have to jump and join another meeting. But thank you very much again for having us, and looking forward to working together with you all.
Thank you very much for joining us and making yourself available for this meeting. So far, I see John to also provide the closing remarks for our session.
Yeah, thanks, Joyce. I just want to quickly also respond to the question on business and indigenous peoples, which is actually one of the focus thematic area that IPRI is working on. We are actually developing the roadmap of indigenous peoples on how to strengthen the respect, protection, and access to justice of indigenous peoples in business, and using, of course, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, but specifically focusing on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the framework. And as Bestang mentioned earlier, the need for the free, prior, and informed consent. So this is an invitation to the indigenous peoples here, that if you wish to be part of the indigenous peoples roadmap on business and indigenous peoples rights, please get in touch with my colleagues, so you can also share your thoughts and strategies on how we will address this. And this will also include the issue of the renewable energy, the just transition, because we know that it's proceeding as business as usual, and as earlier presented, it's actually causing land grabs, and the threat for more of land grabs, destruction of livelihoods, and even abuse of women will multiply with the increase in renewable energy that are not the result of partnership or not based on the consent of indigenous peoples. So we're very much aware of that. And in relation to this, we actually already have done case studies on business activities, including renewable energy projects. And we will launch the report towards the end of January. And together with it will be the Indigenous Peoples roadmap on promoting and advancing Indigenous peoples' rights in business, using the UN guiding principles as well as the UN Declaration and other international human rights instruments. So I just want to mention that. The other two themes that we are also working on is the issue of conservation and indigenous people's rights. So those are, we already had a report on that, but this is going to be a continuing issue, and that's also why we're working closely with the organization of Jackson and other organizations as well that are having difficulties or facing human rights violations through conservation by states and conservation organizations. The third issue is the incarceration and access to justice. No, that's another area where we are also very much wants to do more work, but we're starting with research to fully understand the extent of the problem in relation to the incarceration of indigenous peoples and the challenges in relation to access to justice. So that's I just want to add that. And finally, just to also make just to inform our participants that IPRI has a legal and sanctuary fund, which supports communities and environment defenders. And what we support is not just a monetary support, but also political and technical support, even campaigning, if that would be useful. So we work with communities in the spirit of solidarity, because we are indigenous, and that is also one of the things that we want to ensure, that the connection of local to global and global to local. And it's through our support in the legal and sanctuary fund that we can do this kind of work if that is something that is needed, no, by communities. So those needing this kind of support also feel free to get in touch with us. And finally, just to thank all our panelists, our colleagues, our leaders, and also our reactors for this event. And as we commemorate Human Rights Week, this is also the time for us, as Besang mentioned, to strengthen our global solidarity, that in the face of all these difficulties and the severe violations of our rights, it is also in our strength, it is in our collective strength, and it's in our solidarity that we can effectively address this and advance the Indigenous peoples movement. So I just want to thank everybody here, my colleagues, the interpreters, and again to all of you. And we hope that you will keep in touch with us and also to join us again next year when we launch our report on business, Indigenous peoples and business, and also the Indigenous peoples roadmap. So thank you and good day to everyone and good evening. Maraming salamat. Agbyag tayo amin. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, John. Thanks everyone for joining us. We have your email addresses for the participants, and the information that John had shared, you can definitely share them again through our emails. If not, check them in our website, especially our legal and sanctuary fund that's available in our website. Thank you, everyone.